Right now, if you walk into any grocery store in America, you will find avocados stacked in a bin near the entrance, priced somewhere between $1 and $2 each. You probably walk past them without thinking much about it. But the fact that this strange, prehistoric fruit, one that technically should have gone extinct thousands of years ago, is now the centerpiece of a global industry worth over $13 billion a year, that is a story worth telling. This video is about how avocados got here. Not just the farming history or the food trend stuff, but the full arc. From a fruit that co-evolved with giant ground sloths in prehistoric South America to the thing millennials supposedly can't stop buying. Most people who eat avocados have no idea how close this fruit came to disappearing from the planet entirely, or how many unlikely turns it took to end up on your toast. So let's go back to the beginning, because the beginning is genuinely strange. About 10,000 years ago, large parts of North and South America were home to megafauna, enormous animals that had roamed the continent for millions of years. Mammoths, giant ground sloths, horse-like creatures, massive gomphothers that looked something like elephants. These animals were big enough to swallow a whole avocado, pit and all, and walk away. And that mattered, because the avocado's entire survival strategy was built around them. The way most fruit trees spread is through animals. A bird eats a berry, flies somewhere, and drops the seed in its droppings. The seed germinates, a new tree grows. The avocado worked the same way, except the seed is enormous. That pit in the center of every avocado you have ever eaten is too large for almost any animal alive today to swallow whole. A modern bird can't do it. A fox can't do it. Even most large mammals today would struggle. But a giant ground sloth, an animal that could weigh up to 4 tons and reach leaves 20 feet off the ground, had no problem at all. It would eat the whole fruit, digest the flesh, and deposit the seed somewhere new. The avocado and these megafauna had co-evolved over millions of years into a perfect partnership. Then, roughly 13,000 years ago, almost all of those large animals went extinct. The exact cause is still debated: climate change at the end of the last ice age, overhunting by early humans, probably some combination of both, but the result was the same. The avocado's main seed dispersers were gone. By every reasonable ecological logic, the avocado should have gone extinct too. The seeds were too big, the fruit too heavy, the range too limited without something large enough to carry it. And yet, it survived. The reason it survived is because humans were already there. The indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica, the region stretching from central Mexico down through Guatemala and into Honduras, had been living alongside wild avocado trees for thousands of years before the megafauna disappeared. And when those large animals vanished, humans essentially stepped into the role, not intentionally, not as some kind of conservation effort, but simply because the fruit was useful. People ate it, carried the seeds, and over time deliberately began cultivating the trees near their settlements. The earliest confirmed evidence of avocado consumption by humans comes from a cave in the Tehuacan Valley in Mexico, where archaeologists found avocado seeds dating back roughly 10,000 years. These were wild avocados, small and mostly pit, not much like the buttery Hass variety you buy today. But people were eating them, and that relationship would eventually change everything about the fruit. By around 5,000 years ago, avocados were being actively cultivated in Mesoamerica. Farmers in what is now Mexico and Central America were selecting the best trees, the ones with larger fruit, thinner skin, smaller pits, and replanting them deliberately. This is the same basic process that turned wild teosinte grass into modern corn, or bitter wild almonds into the sweet ones we eat today. Slow, patient, generation by generation selection that gradually pushed the plant toward something more useful. The Aztecs called it a huacatal. The word also meant testicle in the Nahuatl language, almost certainly because of the way the fruits hang in pairs from the branches. The Aztecs were not subtle about this, but the avocado wasn't just food, it was medicine, cosmetic, and status symbol all at once. Aztec and Maya texts describe using avocado flesh to treat skin conditions and wounds. The oil was worked into hair. The leaves and bark were used in various remedies. In some regions, avocado trees were so valuable that they were used as boundary markers for land. Planting one near the edge of your property was a way of staking a claim, and the fruit itself appeared regularly in the diets of Aztec nobility, which tells you something about how it was valued. This was not peasant food. It was rich, fatty, calorie-dense, and the trees took years to mature and produce fruit. Owning a productive avocado tree was a form of wealth. That's important. But what happened when Europeans arrived completely rewrote the avocado's trajectory in ways nobody could have predicted. When Spanish conquistadors entered Mesoamerica in the early 1500s, they encountered a lot of unfamiliar foods. Tomatoes, chocolate, chili peppers, corn, all of these were new to European eyes. The avocado was among them. The first written European description of the avocado comes from a Spanish explorer named Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, who encountered it in Colombia in 1526 and wrote about the fruit's soft, buttery flesh and the large seed inside. He seemed genuinely impressed, which was not always the case when Spanish explorers encountered new foods. Some things they wrote off entirely. The avocado they kept coming back to. Over the following decades, Spanish colonists spread avocado cultivation across their territories in the Americas. By the mid-1500s, trees were being grown in Peru, in Ecuador, throughout Central America and the Caribbean. The Spanish also carried the fruit back to Europe, though it never really took hold there in any meaningful way. The climate wasn't right, the trees were difficult to grow outside of tropical and subtropical conditions, and European palates at the time were not exactly primed for a savory, fatty fruit that tasted nothing like anything they already knew. In Spain and Portugal, it became a curiosity. In the Americas, it kept spreading. The English got their first real taste of the avocado in the late 1600s. An English doctor and naturalist named Hans Sloane encountered the fruit in Jamaica in 1696 and brought back detailed descriptions of it. English colonists in the Caribbean had already been eating avocados for a while by then, having picked up the habit from the local population, and they had their own name for it, the alligator pear, a reference to the bumpy green skin and pear-like shape of some varieties. That name stuck in English-speaking countries for a surprisingly long time. You will still find it in old American recipe books well into the 20th century. By the 1700s, avocados had a foothold in the Caribbean and parts of the southern United States, but they were still a regional, largely tropical food. Growing them outside of warm climates was difficult. The fruit bruised easily and didn't travel well, and most Americans had no real context for what to do with something that tasted the way an avocado tastes. The cultural framework for it just wasn't there yet. The shift toward the United States as an avocado market started in California, and it started slowly. The first recorded avocado tree planted in California dates to 1871, when a judge named R.B. Ord brought trees from Mexico to Santa Barbara. The climate in Southern California turned out to be nearly perfect, warm, dry, with the right kind of soil in certain areas. Other growers took notice, and through the 1880s and 1890s, small-scale avocado cultivation began spreading across the region. But there was a serious problem, and it was the same problem that had always limited the avocado's spread. The fruit was inconsistent. When you grow avocados from seed, the offspring are not reliable copies of the parent tree. You might plant a seed from a delicious, large-fruited tree and get something completely different, smaller, stringier, with a worse flavor. This is just how avocados work genetically. It made commercial farming nearly impossible because you couldn't guarantee what you were going to get. The solution was grafting. Instead of growing trees from seed, farmers learned to take cuttings from trees with desirable traits and graft them onto rootstock, essentially cloning the best trees rather than leaving the outcome to chance. This technique had been used in agriculture for thousands of years with other crops, but applying it systematically to avocados in California changed everything. Suddenly, you could plant an orchard and know, with reasonable certainty, what kind of fruit you were going to get. And this is where one of the most important figures in avocado history enters the picture. In 1926, a mail carrier and amateur horticulturalist named Rudolf Hass planted a seed in his small orchard in La Habra Heights, California. The seed came from a nursery, and when the tree began producing fruit, Hass tried 3 times to graft it over to a different, more commercially popular variety. Each time, the grafts failed, so he let the tree grow as it was. What it produced was unlike anything else being grown in California at the time. The fruit had a pebbly, dark skin that turned nearly black when ripe, which was actually a useful signal for consumers who had no idea how to tell if an avocado was ready to eat. The flesh was rich, creamy, with a nutty flavor and a relatively small pit. It kept better than other varieties and had a longer window of ripeness. Hass patented the variety in 1935, the first patent ever granted for a tree in the United States, and began selling budwood to nurseries. The Hass avocado spread quickly through California's growing avocado industry. By the 1950s, it was becoming the dominant commercial variety, and it remains so today. Somewhere around 80% of all avocados grown globally are Hass. Every single one of them is a genetic clone of that one tree in Rudolf Hass's backyard. The original tree died in 2002, but its descendants are literally everywhere. That's the origin of the fruit most people know today, but it still doesn't explain how the avocado went from a California specialty crop to a global obsession. That part of the story involves Mexico, trade policy, and a marketing campaign that is genuinely one of the most successful in food industry history. For most of the 20th century, avocados were a niche product in the United States. California growers produced them, and there was a loyal customer base, particularly in the Southwest and among communities with Mexican and Latin American roots, where the fruit had always been part of the diet. But the broader American market was lukewarm. Avocados were expensive, confusing to buy because most people didn't know when they were ripe, and there wasn't a strong cultural tradition around eating them in mainstream American cooking. In 1973, California avocado growers formed what eventually became the California Avocado Commission, partly to coordinate marketing and promotion. They ran campaigns, pushed avocados into supermarkets, and made some headway. But the industry was still limited by supply. California could only grow so many avocados, and the season was relatively short. The bigger change came from Mexico, and it came through a trade fight that lasted decades. Mexico is the world's largest avocado producer, and the state of Michoacán in particular has soil and climate conditions that are almost absurdly well suited to growing Hass avocados. But for most of the 20th century, Mexican avocados were banned from the United States market. The official reason was phytosanitary concerns. The USDA claimed that Mexican avocados might carry pests and diseases that could threaten California's domestic crop. Mexican growers and many economists argued that the ban was really about protecting California farmers from cheaper competition. Both things were probably at least partially true. The ban began to lift in 1997 when Mexican avocados were first allowed into certain U.S. states during winter months. It expanded further through the early 2000s, and by 2007, Mexican avocados had full year-round access to the entire U.S. market. The effect on supply was dramatic. Suddenly, avocados were available in much larger quantities, at lower prices, and year-round rather than seasonally. That combination, more supply, lower prices, consistent availabilities, is a precondition for any food going from specialty to staple. But supply alone doesn't create a cultural phenomenon. Something else was happening at the same time, and it had to do with how Americans were thinking about fat. For most of the second half of the 20th century, dietary fat was the enemy. The low-fat movement, which peaked in the 1980s and 1990s, had convinced a huge portion of the American population that fat in food was directly responsible for fat on the body and disease in the heart. This was bad news for avocados, which are roughly 15% fat by weight. The California Avocado Commission spent years trying to navigate this, at one point running campaigns that emphasized the avocado's nutritional value while carefully avoiding too much emphasis on its fat content. Then the science shifted. By the early 2000s, researchers were drawing clearer distinctions between different types of fat, and the monounsaturated fats in avocados were being recognized as genuinely beneficial, the kind associated with reduced cardiovascular risk rather than increased. The avocado went from being a food people felt vaguely guilty about to being a food people felt virtuous eating. That reframing was enormously powerful, and it coincided almost perfectly with the rise of food culture on the internet. The early 2010s brought Instagram, food blogs, and a generation of people who were not only interested in eating well, but in photographing what they ate and sharing it. Avocado toast, which is at its core just mashed avocado on bread, turned out to be visually perfect for this. The green color photographs beautifully, the texture is interesting, and you can dress it up with seeds, eggs, chili flakes, whatever you want. It became a symbol of a certain kind of urban, health-conscious lifestyle, which made it aspirational, which made it spread faster. By the mid-2010s, avocado toast was on menus from Melbourne to Manhattan, and the avocado had completed one of the most remarkable journeys from regional specialty to global icon in modern food history. If you are finding this story as fascinating as I do, there is a whole world of similar histories waiting for you. How sugar went from sacred medicine to the engine of the slave trade, how the potato saved and then devastated Europe, how tea literally redrew the map of the world. Those videos are on this channel, and if you watch them back to back, you start to see a pattern in how ordinary foods quietly shaped everything. Subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment below telling me which food or ingredient you want to see covered next. Those comments genuinely influence what gets made. Now, back to the avocado, because there's a side of this story that doesn't get talked about enough. The explosion in global avocado demand over the past 2 decades has had serious consequences in the places where most of them are grown. In Michoacán, Mexico, which produces roughly half of the world's avocado supply, the economic boom from avocado exports has been extraordinary. The region generates billions of dollars a year from what locals call green gold. But the same wealth has attracted organized crime. Drug cartels, particularly the cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación and the Knights Templar before them, recognized that avocado orchards were an enormously profitable business and moved in to extort growers, control distribution, and in some cases take over farms outright. By the early 2020s, the U.S. government had temporarily suspended its food safety inspectors from the region after one of them received death threats. The avocado business in Michoacán is tangled up with violence in ways that most consumers in the United States or Europe have no awareness of when they're splitting one open for lunch. There are also significant environmental costs. Avocado trees require a substantial amount of water, roughly 70 liters per fruit, which sounds almost unbelievable but is accurate. In parts of Chile and Mexico, where avocado farming has expanded rapidly to meet global demand, rivers and aquifers have been depleted, and local communities have lost access to water that they depended on for generations. In Chile's Petorca province, small farmers and rural residents have watched their water sources dry up as large avocado plantations upstream divert the supply. Deforestation is another issue. In Michoacán, illegal clearing of pine and fir forests to plant avocado orchards has accelerated significantly since the trade boom began. Satellite imagery shows the scale of it clearly. Thousands of acres of forest replaced with avocado trees, which are less biodiverse, more water-intensive, and more vulnerable to the kind of monoculture diseases that have devastated other crops throughout history. None of this means the avocado is uniquely villainous among global commodities. The history of almost every food that has scaled to global production involves some version of this story: environmental stress, labor exploitation, the concentration of profit at the top of the supply chain. Coffee, chocolate, bananas, beef, they all carry versions of the same weight. But it is worth knowing, especially for a fruit that has become so thoroughly associated with wellness and conscious consumption in the popular imagination. The avocado's story is also, in a strange way, a story about survival against the odds. This is a fruit that by all ecological logic should have vanished from the earth 13,000 years ago when the animals it depended on went extinct. It survived because humans found it useful, cultivated it, carried it across continents, and eventually built an entire global industry around it. That's a remarkable run for something that started as a snack for giant ground sloths in prehistoric Mexico. From the caves of Tehuacan to the Aztec markets of Tenochtitlan, from the ships of Spanish conquistadors to the orchards of Southern California, from a mail carrier's backyard experiment to 80% of the world's avocado supply, the Hass variety alone is one of the most successful agricultural clones in history. And from the trade disputes of the 1990s to the Instagram feeds of the 2010s, the avocado has proven repeatedly that it is extraordinarily good at finding the next thing that keeps it alive. The next time you cut one open and find that the pit is just slightly too big to make sense for the world we live in today, that's not a design flaw, that's a fossil, a remnant of a relationship with animals that no longer exist, preserved inside a fruit that refused to disappear. And somehow, against all odds, it ended up on your kitchen counter.